Shalom. Shalom, welcome back to our Codigo Able channel, where we continue to publish and study the Mishnah, this great encyclopedia of ancient knowledge of oral tradition, which allows us to understand the distant and often complicated biblical text in a simple and straightforward way. I hope you're enjoying all the content we've been publishing on our channel and that you, if you haven't already, are being motivated to study the Bible from a Hebrew and academic perspective, and that all this will be a blessing in your life. I also remind you, if you haven't already, to subscribe to our channel. This will greatly help us continue to grow and help the fire of the Torah spread throughout our Spanish-speaking community. So please subscribe to the channel and give us a like to help the algorithm show this content to many more people. I also remind you that there are many more past classes, which you can find in our YouTube video playlist, where you can watch or review any class of interest or start the course from the introduction. You can also visit us on our website at codigoable.com. Without further ado, this is Abel Flores, a journalist passionate about biblical studies and the secrets of the ancient world. Let's begin. Now, let's begin our lesson today, which is located in Mishnah Berakhot 2.7, which reads as follows. When Rabban Gamliel's slave Tavi died, he accepted condolences for him. His disciples asked him, "Did you not teach us, Master, that condolences are not accepted for slaves?" He replied, "My slave Tavi is not like other slaves. He was a virtuous man." Well, what a great topic we have today in our class, because all of this takes us back to the time of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, back to the ancient world, and what relationships between people were like in those days. As you can imagine, everything was very different from today, and this is precisely why it is important to know the context of the biblical text compiled in the Mishnah. Here, another exceptional incident is recounted because, as you may already know, whenever the name of Rabban Gamliel comes up, the incident is exceptional, strange, and contains a lesson that goes beyond a simple reading, because Rabban Gamliel, president of the Sanhedrin of his time, always seeks to elevate the Torah to its own limits. Also, remember, in case you're a little confused, that this very Rabban Gamliel is the one the Apostle Paul or Saul of Tarsus says in the book of Acts was his teacher, having been educated at his feet. Therefore, understanding how Rabban Gamliel interpreted the Torah brings us closer to understanding the Pauline epistles. All of this is based on a scholarly study and a Hebrew perspective of the scriptures, because we are precisely seeking to understand 1st and 2nd century Judaism, and the primary work for this is the Mishnah. Now, this Mishnah tells us that when his slave Tavi died, Rabban Gamliel accepted condolences for his death as if he were a close relative. His students said to him, "Have you not taught us, Master, that condolences are not accepted for the death of slaves?" Rabban Gamliel said to his students, "My slave Tavi is not like other slaves. He was virtuous, and it is appropriate to give him the same respect as a relative." Well, the first thing is to learn the laws of mourning according to Judaism, the weekly mourning that is called Shiva in Hebrew. If you haven't watched the previous class, you should do so, because there we study these laws and traditions so you can understand what's really going on here. So I'll continue this class with the understanding that you already know the laws of mourning or Shiva, but again, you can listen to the previous class, and there are detailed explanations, because in the previous Mishnah it is said that Rabban Gamliel bathed on the first night of mourning when his wife died. Now let's go. The key line says that when Tavi died, Rabban Gamliel received condolences, and in response to the objection of the students who said, "Didn't you teach us that condolences are not received for slaves?" he replied, "Tavi is not like other slaves. He was kosher, virtuous." It's interesting that the word this Mishnah uses to refer to this slave is kasher, which literally means permitted, like kosher food or food permitted by the Torah for a Jew to eat. But in most translations, you'll see them use the word virtuous, like a virtuous slave. But what's all this about? The Gemara of the Babylonian Talmud, Berakhot 16b, reiterates the general rule: no line of mourners is formed, nor are customary phrases recited for slaves, and recounts the same incident involving Gamliel and his beloved slave Tavi. You should know that in the last 3 Mishnayot, or teachings, for exceptional incidents are linked with Rabban Gamliel. For example, he bathed on the first night of mourning for his wife. He recited the Shema on their wedding night. He accepted condolences for Tavi, and the next Mishnah will also speak of Rabban Gamliel. There is a secret here, a teaching that is more than a secret. It is a cry that the Tanna Kama, the editor of the Mishnah, wants to tell us. And we have already studied it and are still studying it, the difference between the commandments of the Torah and their limitations, and the rabbinic restrictions for preserving, keeping, and fulfilling those biblical commandments. Rabban Gamliel is extremely strict when it comes to fulfilling a Torah commandment, but when it comes to regulations, halakha, which are the rabbinic restrictions for fulfilling the Torah, Gamliel is less strict. The common thread is how an authority applies the law, balancing standards, personal piety, and dignity. These Mishnayot teach us to prioritize our actions when fulfilling the Torah's commandments. Now, we need to explain the historical postulates from the Second Temple period and from the ancient world in general. Here we begin a study of slavery in the Bible and the Mishnah period. With the minimal historical context, we need to fully understand the Mishnah. Remember that this is an academic study or course, and we must adhere as closely as possible to the historical postulates to avoid anachronisms, which are nothing more than misinterpretations when adopting modern concepts in a world where our way of thinking did not exist. In the ancient world, there were slaves, period. What's more? In case you don't know, in some parts of the world, in some countries today in the 21st century, unfortunately, there are still slaves. Now, we need to study the following acronym, AP, which stands for Ancient Near East. In this region of the world in the 1st and 2nd centuries, and later as well, slavery was a structural institution, whether for debt, as spoils of war, or as human trafficking. Mesopotamian codes punished with death anyone who concealed or aided a runaway slave and rewarded their capture. For example, this can be found in the famous Code of Hammurabi 15-17. During the time of the Roman Empire, which is the same period as the Mishnah we are studying, slave society was on a massive scale. At this time, there were not only thousands, but millions of slaves. There was a hunt for runaway slaves and a labor market where slavery was central to trade and the economy. Slaves were the economic engine. Sad? Very sad, but this is our universal history. Now that you understand this, you should know that slavery as an economic activity is the socio-legal background of early rabbinic Judaism, that is, the 1st and 2nd centuries, where we focus on studying, understanding, and delving deeper into the Mishnah. But what does the Torah say about slavery? Biblical legislation distinguishes between nivdivri, which means like a Hebrew slave, closer to servitude for debts, whether personal or familial, and Moed Katan, which literally means a Canaanite slave or a non-Israelite slave. The key rules are freedom of the Hebrew slave at age 6 and endowment upon leaving, in Hebrew, Halakha in Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15. You can read where manumission is established in the 7th year, in Hebrew, Shemitah, and the obligation to deliver goods to the freedman. In fact, in Leviticus 25, the Jubilee liberation of a slave is added. That is, the Torah of Moses, which is many centuries older than the Roman Empire itself, which boasts to this day of law, democracy, and freedom. The Torah of Moses itself, although more archaic in years, is more advanced in rights and civil liberty. Because during the Sabbath rest, which is the 7th year or Shemitah, when the land of Israel rested, in that same year all slaves were freed, or at least given the opportunity to be free. And this is a very interesting point you should know. It was an optional matter for the slave, whether to be free or not. Because, believe it or not, there were slaves who didn't want to stop being slaves, because, after all, they had no other life, and their master had to support them and their families for the rest of their lives. In fact, if you know history, during the emancipation of slaves in the United States, as in the colonial era in Latin America, after the libertarian emancipation against the European empires, there were many. Thousands of slaves who decided to stay with their masters because they had nowhere else to go, didn't know what else to do, what to do. Now, taking advantage of this, we can understand why, when the children of Israel learn of Egypt as a people of slaves, God has to give them the Torah. That is, He has to educate them, give them knowledge, teachings, Mishnayot, so that they may know how to be free. In other words, freedom is primarily a mental or spiritual issue. You have to be free in your mind to truly be free in your body, that is, to escape physical slavery. In the fourth commandment of the Decalogue, which is about keeping the Sabbath, the male and female servant is explicitly included so that they may rest like you. In other words, this is speaking of your slaves, those who live in your house, on your land, in your country. Even they have to keep the Sabbath. In other words, here the very sanctity of the land of Israel grants freedom to the slave on Shabbat, so that they may be free that day. It's also important to know that there were fugitive slaves protected, and the Torah prohibits the return of runaway slaves. This is an extraordinary measure, radically opposed to the slavery of other peoples and cultures in the ancient world, where it was required to return them. In the Torah, if a slave fled from another country or people and arrived in Israel, they had the option of being free. Israel is a land of salvation for slaves. The Torah of Moses also has rules for freeing slaves, because if you study the Torah thoroughly, you'll realize that the Torah doesn't want slaves. It wants to extinguish slavery, to deteriorate it, but progressively, not radically. Perhaps the Torah understood that in its time, slavery was more than just the economic engine of its time, and eliminating it overnight could be worse for the community. That's why the Torah, like no other law or constitution of the ancient world, provides for bodily protections. That is, an injury to an eye or a tooth is grounds for immediate freedom for the slave. Only the Torah has this law in the entire system of ancient slavery. The Torah is unique in this case, as in many others as well. Moreover, you should know that for the Torah, murder is a cardinal sin among the 10 Commandments. But there is something the Torah views as even worse, and this is learned from Parsha Mishpatim, where the civil commandments are listed in order of importance. The worst is not murder, as you might believe. Rather, the most severe penalty in the Torah of Moses' penal code is kidnapping for enslavement. The Torah mandates the death penalty for kidnapping anyone and for selling people. For over 3 millennia, the Torah has stated that human trafficking is the worst evil in society. The Torah also provides an ethical and memorial mandate for all who study and follow it. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt. This mandate informs social ethics. Do not oppress the foreigner, because you yourself were a foreigner in Egypt. Conclusion of this section. The Torah does not abolish slavery outright, but limits it, humanizes it, and regulates the institution. A finite period of 7 years, compensation, rest, refuge for the fugitive. Because Israel is like a land of refugees and marginalized people, and the Torah strongly sanctions human trafficking. This is something very unique about the Torah compared to its legal context in the ancient world, and even in the modern world. In fact, think about this. The Roman Empire was an oppressive empire that enslaved and forced all people under its military rule to pay taxes to Caesar. The Jewish people in Israel were one of these people. How do you think a Roman legislator or senator felt, or what they thought when they read the Torah? They were learning about a book that undermines their own socio-political model. This is mainly why you can see that throughout world history, many tyrants, kings, emperors, and dictators have hated the Torah in particular and the Bible in general, because you will know the truth, which is the Torah, and the truth will set you free. We will study this and many other things in the Parasha of Lech Lecha, which speaks of the patriarch Abraham, called the friend of God, who dedicated himself to freeing slaves, not only spiritually, but literally. Abraham freed slaves in a world where slavery was our daily bread. Now that we've studied the history or historical context of slavery in the ancient world and in the time of the Torah of Moses, which is an ancient period located between the Bronze and Iron Ages. But what does this mean? There's a very big difference in the art of war whether you have bronze swords or iron swords. Iron is a superior technology, which allows you to dominate peoples who don't master that iron technology. But let's continue. Let's now study what slaves were like in the Mishnah and Talmud period, that is, very close to the time of the Second Temple, because here we see realities different from those in the time of Moses. Remember, the only constant in this life is change. And in every era, the circumstances and contexts are different. In the Mishnah Kiddushin 1:2, acquisitions and manumission of the Eve Divri, or the Hebrew slave, are defined, whether through money or a marriage certificate, and one is freed after 7 years. through the Jubilee, or through a prorated ransom. Do you remember when we studied in this course what weddings were like in the time of the Second Temple? Well, this is what is being discussed in Kiddushin, which was the first part of the wedding, which lasted a week. In the marriage certificate, slaves were listed as inheritances of the new marriage, or as gifts for the new marriage, but a record was given of the years remaining for the Hebrew slave to be free in Shemitah, the 7th year. But remember that this freedom was optional for the Hebrew slave. Here is a historical reality. Hebrew serfs or slaves depend on the Yovel, that is, the 50-year cycle. Medieval rabbinic jurists, such as Rabban Maimonides, stated that when the Jubilee was not in effect, the practice of the Yves d'Ivry or the Hebrew slave ceased. In the post-exilic and rabbinic era, case law focused more on the Moed Katan. What is being said here is very important. As long as there is no temple built and functioning, there is no Jubilee, there is no Yobel, so there are no laws for the Hebrew slave. This is something that only applies, that is, it is active or functioning exclusively when the temple is standing. And I'm going to tell you something you may not know. Without Yobel, which we now know depends on the temple, there are no conversions to Judaism valid according to the Torah of Moses for multiple reasons that we won't go into in depth here. But we will, in the Mishnah, and specifically the Berakhot, which are classified Mishnayot, address this topic. Because here we promise you, B'Elai Neder, that we will study the entire Mishnah from beginning to end. But why are there conversions to Judaism today? Because they are rabbinic conversions, with rabbinic authority, with their regulations and traditions. But the authority of Moses' Torah does not apply today in this matter. It is inactive in Torah conversions, because, as I have already said, there is no Yobel, and without a Yobel, there are no laws for the Hebrew slave. So, now that you know that the laws for the Hebrew slave do not apply today, just as the sacrifices in the temple do not apply, what applies? The Canaanite slave applies to the laws of the Moed Katan, which is acquired by money, a document, or acts of possession. It is freed by a document, a price, or injury. The codifying literature details ways of manumission that are studied in other Mishnayot, not the one we are studying today. You should also know that the Torah requires freeing a slave for a mitzvah, although some texts restrict freeing without cause. The sages or rabbis of this period of the Mishnah allow, and even mandate manumission to enable the fulfillment of a precept. For example, completing a quorum or minyan to perform certain important prayers in the synagogue, such as Kaddish or Amidah. This principle erodes practical perpetuity. The ethics of treatment, Rabban Maimonides in Avadim 9, insists on not humiliating or burdening, but rather feeding and caring for the slave, and recommends going beyond the letter of the law in favor of compassion. Why does Maimonides say this? Because in the 12th century, where Rambam lived, there was no temple, and he and his community lived in Morocco, outside of Israel. Is there a difference between the authority of Moses' Torah with regard to slaves, where the temple must exist for there to be Hebrew slaves, and when this does not occur, what there are only Canaanite slaves? In a later codification, in the 16th century, Shulchan Aruch Dayat 267 systematizes obligations and paths of liberation for slaves, reflecting the rabbinic tendency to narrow the scope of dominion over the slave. This set of ideas does not immediately eliminate slavery, especially that of the Canaanite Eved, but it traces a trajectory to reduce, enclose, and moralize until it becomes incompatible with the founding ideals. Liberation from Egypt and universal rest. Contemporary authors have emphasized the biblical rupture with the politics of the ancient world in the Egyptian, Babylonian, and Persian empires, as well as the Greek and Roman empires, and its egalitarian impulse. Without sharing all of their theses, this analysis contextualizes the Torah's direction in a progressive liberation from slavery. Because you will know the truth, which is the Torah, and the truth will set you free. This is what Jesus or Yeshua was talking about in the first century. He is speaking of his disciples being truly free, as the Torah promises to those who obey it, and remember that at that time they were under Roman rule. Now, before moving forward, let's make a preliminary conclusion. The Torah does not legitimize slavery. It penalizes it. It drastically limits Hebrew servitude while the temple is standing. It humanizes the treatment of all people. It institutes cyclical rest periods and releases. It protects fugitives. And it anchors everything in the memory of the anti-empire, which is the Exodus. And in the time of the Mishnah, the sages further strengthened the practice with avenues for manumission and ethical demands. The result, a gradual program of de-enslavement that, due to its political and moral logic, clashes head-on with kings and emperors who uphold slave systems. But here is a very important question. In the time of the slave Tavi and Rabban Gamliel, was there a temple or not? The Mishnah period is the key to understanding all this, because the Mishnah sages of the 1st century, before the year 70, such as Hillel and Shammai, lived with the temple standing, as did Jesus and his apostles. But by the 2nd century, the Tanaim, who were forced to write down the oral Torah in the Mishnah, were without a temple. Many laws were then changed, including the law of the Yobel, which depends on the temple and activates or deactivates the law of foreigners, converts, and slaves. Never forget this. Now, if we're going to delve into the exegesis of this Mishnah, what's happening with Tavi? There was a general rule. In a Baraita cited in Berakhot 16b and later codified for male and female slaves who die, there is no line of consolation, nor are the usual mourning phrases recited. The owner is given a brief condolence. Hamakam Yemelech Shasraneka, may the omnipresent restore your loss, similar to what is said for the loss of a work animal. But in the Mishnah for this class today, there is an exception. Gamliel did receive condolences for Tavi because he was not like other slaves. He was kosher. The Gemara does not abrogate the rule. Rather, it indicates that this was an extraordinary case given Tavi's moral character and intellectual status. Some commentaries refer to the Yerushalmi Talmud. From here we learn that a beloved disciple is like a son, which places Tavi closer to Gamliel's family as his student than to an anonymous servant or Canaanite slave, since there was no temple in Tavi's time. Note that this is the key to understanding this Mishnah. But who is Tavi? We have evidence in other sources because Tavi is the most famous slave in the entire Mishnah and Talmud. In Sukkah 20b, Tavi sleeps under the bed in the Sukkah. Gamliel explains that Tavi knows the law and that, Canaanite, slaves are exempt from the precept of the Sukkah, hence his behavior. This portrays Tavi as studious and aware of halakha. Pious practices. Secondary sources record traditions that Tavi wore tefillin despite his exemption, which reinforces his piety. But what was Tavi's legal status? He was an Eved Kanani, that is, he was a slave in Israel, but without a temple, meaning he could not convert with temple authority, only with rabbinic authority. And herein lies the difference between Gamliel and his fellow rabbis in this Mishnah, as in the previous ones where he differed from the rabbinic sections. Although Gamliel was the president of the Sanhedrin, decisions had to be made by vote. When the temple was standing, the freeing of slaves, conversions, and other matters were made by the Kohanim, or priests. Do you notice now that without the temple, the authority of Moses' Torah is lost? The Eved Kanani living in Israel had to be circumcised and integrated into the Jewish home. He was bound by prohibitions and positive commandments not bound by time, similar to the halakhic statute of women. Hence their exemption from sukkah and tefillin, but he was never forced to convert to Judaism, because this was optional, as was his liberation from slavery. But was Tavi ever freed? The Talmud Dava, 74b tells us that Rabban Gamliel damaged Tavi's eye and rejoiced, thinking that this would free him, as recorded in Exodus chapter 21 verses 26 to 27. But Rabbi Yehoshua told Gamliel that without witnesses, his confession was not sufficient to free him. This passage suggests that Tavi was not freed at that time, and the Mishnah of Berakhot still calls him his slave upon his death, which fits with that outcome. In other words, the Shachamim call Tavi slave, but Gamliel calls him kosher and honors him in death as a member of his family. That is, Gamliel considers Tavi a convert according to the Torah of Moses, but since there is no temple or conversions because there is no Yobel, Gamliel has no legal way to convert him without Tavi wanting to be free. This famous case embodies the Talmudic principle of kavod habriyat, dignity of persons, which in certain contexts suspends rabbinic decrees to avoid undignified situations, as in Berakhot 19b. Without explicitly stating it here, Gamliel's praxis suggests that personal dignity and virtue can justify honors beyond formal social categories. Tavi was a 2nd century slave of non-Jewish birth, purchased by a Jew, none other than Gamliel. He was required to be circumcised because he was in Israel. Had he been in the diaspora, he would not have had to be circumcised, and he had to immerse himself in the mikveh upon entering Gamliel's own house. Tavi was obligated to all the prohibitions of the Torah and to positive commandments not bound by time, just as Hebrew women were, because these are the laws that apply to Canaanite slaves in Israel, but without a temple. Tavi was exempt from positive precepts bound by time, such as sukkah and tefillin. But the Talmud says that he wore tefillin and lived in the sukkah, but did not sleep in the sukkah bed. In other words, Tavi was in the process of converting, but he never wanted to complete it so as not to be free. Because when he is freed, he automatically becomes a full Jew, in Hebrew, gerhirin. But this was precisely the last step Tavi never wanted to take. He never wanted to convert, because that would mean no longer being a slave, as he had already served Gamliel for more than 7 years. So, Tavi was a slave who studied and kept the Torah, but he never wanted to convert because he didn't want to be freed, because being from Israel or a Jew means you can't be a slave, no way after 7 years. Tavi never completed his conversion because, in his time, there was no longer a temple, and conversion had to be done only by the rabbis, that is, by Rabban. But Rabban Gamliel, who, as we know, is a master of the boundaries of the Torah of Moses and the rabbinic rules of the Torah, honored Tavi when he died as if he were a Jew, which is why he called him kosher, but the other sages called Tavi a slave. Once again, Gamliel shows here his love for exalting the power and limits of the Torah of Moses above the laws of men, that is, rabbinic laws. Now, if you want to interpret it in its historical context, for example, the Apostle Paul's epistles to the Romans, you now have many tools that this Mishnah and this class give you to understand Saul of Tarsus when he addresses a community in Rome, which was under the Roman slavery system. You will be amazed when you read Paul in his original 1st century context, without a temple, in the diaspora, speaking of the law of slaves, of the works of the law of men, under the law and the shadows of the law, or with the curses of the law. All of this is the jurisprudence of a 1st century Tannite from the school of Gamliel. If you interpret it through later Christian dogmatism, you won't understand anything about that original 1st century proto-Christianity. But what is it that prevents you from understanding? Being ignorant of the Mishnah, that small detail leads you astray, misguides you, because you lose the context that the oral Torah provides. See you next video.